And I think what one needs to sort of understand is that George Grenville, who became prime minister after Butte's fall, had a very coherent political economic strategy. It was a coherent political economic strategy to, as Gordon says, to figure out a way to get the colonies to pay for these increasing costs. The problem from the perspective of Grenville's opponents, William Pitt being the leader, who's ironically his brother-in-law, William Pitt's position was, and the position of the so-called radical Whigs, was the problem with that is it's true that North American population is growing and that North Americans are extremely wealthy. But from their perspective, this is a good thing because they understand the economy of the empire in terms of different regions. And what they see as the potentially most productive part of the empire after the 7 Years' War is precisely North America. Why? Because the population is growing, and North Americans have these huge consumer demands. These consumer demands will, in turn, support the development of new manufactures, of things in Britain. And so the idea from Pitt's point of view is it's a very bad idea to raise taxes on the colonists because it's going to take money out of their pockets which they then won't spend on British manufacturers. So he objects to, he and his supporters object to the Sugar Act of 1764, just as actually William Pitt, as a very young man, had objected to the Molasses Act of 1733. And when Pitt becomes prime minister, briefly for his last moments of great sanity, when he is prime minister, Pitt is gradually going insane and getting extremely ill as an old man. But he passes the Freeport Act in 1766, and the idea of the Freeport Act is exactly the opposite of what the Sugar Act was trying to do. What the Freeport Act was trying to do was to increase commerce with the French West Indies, but more importantly, to increase commerce with Spanish America. Why was this? There's this massive population in Spanish America, huge population, dwarfing the population even of North America, and the Spanish have been so focused for so long on extracting silver out of the mines in Mexico and Peru that they've destroyed domestic or indigenous manufacturing. So there's huge demand in Spanish America for manufactured goods, especially cloth and silverware. And so the idea of the Freeport Act was to funnel British manufacturers legally into Spanish America. So that was, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Well, the Stamp Act, as you perhaps know, really changed everything because it was the first time that the English had levied a direct tax on America, in this case, American paper products, mostly playing cards, newspapers, legal documents, and so on. And the outcry was instantaneous and everywhere. There's not a single stamp that was issued. Every stamp agent was mobbed and forced to resign under threat of his life. So from this moment on, there's a Congress, a Stamp Act Congress that meets in New York. Most of the colonies showed up, and they issued a series of declarations, one of which said, we are entitled to all the rights of Englishmen, and that's important to keep in mind. We don't want to lose some of the obvious things here in this conversation. No. They appeal to the rights of Englishmen, among which is the right not to be taxed without consent of their representatives. And since by local circumstances we cannot be represented by the House of Commons, that representation must be in our provincial legislatures. From that position, they never deviated. But there was a problem for the colonists because they had agreed, and I think constitutionally they had agreed that Parliament had a right to regulate the trade. They had agreed to the Navigation Acts of the 17th century. They had agreed essentially to they never really protested the Molasses Act in constitutional terms. They all agreed that Britain had a right to regulate their trade, but did not have a right to tax them. Now the problem emerges, and they're trying to explain their experience. So they go through a series in this debate that opens up now in the mid-60s. One of the great debates in Western culture over the nature of representation and over the nature, ultimately, of sovereignty. Now, the first thing was representation. The English respond, and you can elaborate on this, the English respond by saying, look, you are represented in the House of Commons. You're virtually represented. They actually use that term, which is now part of our cyberspace. You're virtually represented. He said, look, we have people in England that don't elect representatives. There's the burgeoning cities of Manchester and Leeds and Birmingham, which have 50,000 people in them, and they don't vote for any member of Parliament. There's Old Sarum, which has no subjects, just a lord appoints them, and the Dunwich, the town of Dunwich had long slipped into the North Sea, but still sent 2 representatives to the House of Commons. Now, from an American point of view, that was absurd. If you can understand, the American conception of representation was built, and they called it actual representation. Now, the British system, and virtual representation is quite defensible, and maybe we can get into that, but the basic assumption is that election is incidental to representation. Incidental. How the guy gets there doesn't matter. It's what he stands for, and it's the mutuality of interest between him and his the constituency, the commons, if you will, that really matters. Now, for the Americans, election is the criterion of representation. If you can follow what I'm saying, if you don't elect, then you're not represented. If you can't vote, then you're not represented. Now, the English could not hold that system. Only 1 out of 6 adult males could vote. In America, it's a lot better. It's about 2 out of 3 adult white males could vote. And for Americans, the process of election became central. And their sense of representation, unlike the English, which had grown up over the centuries and all of the residential requirements had fallen away. And as you know, even today, a member of Parliament does not have to be a resident in the constituency he or she represents. But in America, that became very crucial. And representation in America grew up gradually, and people could remember when a new town was created in Massachusetts, they get 2 people, 2 men to send to the general court. When a new county is created in Virginia, and this was in human memory, 2 members were sent to the House of Burgesses. In England, the whole process is lost in the midst, essentially in the midst of time, and there's a justification that Burke sets forth in his Bristol speech for virtual representation. But I would actually give a new, which I haven't heard anyone make, if election is the criterion of representation and the guy you voted for doesn't win, are you represented by his opponent? Think about it. Many of you would probably agree you're not. But the British would not have a problem with that, because the conception of representation does not depend on voting, on election. And so they could easily accommodate the political problem, or the philosophical problem is, are you represented by somebody that you didn't vote for? And I think that's the justification that I would give for virtual representation. But at any rate, the debate was a momentous one and went on for a decade, from 65 to the Declaration of Independence.